December 7, 1941, 7:54 a.m., 1 minute before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Petty Officer First Class Joseph Leon George is aboard the USS Vestal. He's staring at the hull of the USS Arizona. George is part of the repair crew who's checking the battleship to ensure it's ready to deploy with the rest of the Pacific Sea Fleet. He's talking to the other sailors aboard the Vestal about upcoming repairs when they hear the buzzing of plane engines. "What's that?" one of the sailors asks. Suddenly, a whistling sound from above starts to grow louder and louder. "Take cover!" George yells. At that very moment, a Japanese bomb strikes the Arizona and detonates. Fire erupts on the ship's decks. Debris flies everywhere. George's ears ring. He stands up and squints hard to focus his sight. He sways from side to side trying to get his balance. George looks next to him and sees a member of his crewmates trying to stand. He reaches down and helps the sailor up. "Are you okay?" George screams, but he can barely hear his own voice. A moment later, another bomb detonates atop the deck of the USS Arizona. "It's the Japanese!" someone yells. "Get to the guns!" George is about to run to the armory when he sees 6 men trapped in the control tower aboard the Arizona. Flames slowly creep up toward them from all sides. "Help us!" George hears one of the sailors yell. The Arizona has begun to sink. "Cut the line!" a commander shouts to George. The Vestal is still moored to the sinking battleship. George looks at the rope and then at the men trapped in the control tower. As the Arizona continues to be struck by bombs, the tower is slowly listing toward the deck of the Vestal. "I said cut the line, sailor!" the commander yells again. George looks at the knife in his hand for a moment, then sheaths it. He runs to the side of the ship, and instead of cutting the line, he grabs more rope that's lying on the deck. The sailors aboard the Arizona are screaming as the flames engulf the command tower. George doesn't think, he just acts. He waits for the right moment and throws the rope toward the men. One of them catches it. George shouts at the sailors to secure their end and climb across to the Vestal. He prays they can make it aboard before the flames consume them, and they're lost like the thousands of other soldiers who will perish at Pearl Harbor. July 1940, 1 year and 5 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. We cannot allow Japan to continue their expansion in the Pacific. They continue to wage their brutal war in China and have now expanded into Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. A high-ranking general says to the gathered U.S. leadership, "Their brutal war in China has emboldened them. The country has modernized at an astonishing rate, and their navy has become a formidable force. We must act now." President Franklin Delano Roosevelt nods his head. The conflict in Europe is not going well. Seems that authoritarian rule will be the way of the future if the U.S. doesn't aid the allies in Europe and stop Japanese imperialism in the Pacific. But the nation as a whole has decided to stay out of the war after the horrors that were experienced in the Great War. "Very well," the president says. "Impose trade sanctions and implement an oil embargo on Japan. We need to slow their economic growth to disrupt their military expansion." The president pushes his wheelchair back from the table. His advisors rise from their seats, and the commander-in-chief exits the room. Early January 1941, 11 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto meets with other Japanese officials about how to deal with the United States and the sanctions it's placed on Japan. These sanctions have in effect crippled the Japanese empire, cutting it off from badly needed industrial products. If they do nothing, the empire of the rising sun will wither and die on the vine. There's only one choice, and he knows it. He's not sure that a war with the US is wise, but something needs to be done. Yamamoto has quickly risen through the ranks for his strategic prowess and dedication to the imperial cause. "I'm not sure if we can defeat the American Pacific Sea Fleet, especially with their bases in the Philippines and throughout the Pacific waters," Yamamoto warns. Discontented grumbles rise from the other military officers at the meeting. Japanese nationalism is in full swing. Their progress through the Pacific and East Asia has strengthened their fortitude. Many dream of a Japanese empire. "It's not optimal," Prime Minister Tojo Hideki hisses. "We will defeat the Americans, so figure out how to make it possible." Yamamoto sighs and places his hand on a manila folder in front of him. "There may be a way," Yamamoto says. "There's a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. They keep most of the Pacific Sea Fleet there. It could be our only shot." Prime Minister Hideki's eyes seem to reflect the fires of burning warships. As he reads the proposal, his lips curl into a shark-like smile. January 27, 1941, less than 11 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Joseph Grew dashes through a Tokyo alleyway. He hides behind a pile of garbage and pants heavily. He stumbled onto something that the Japanese would kill to keep quiet. He glances around the corner to make sure he isn't being followed. Grew sprints toward a building across the street. It's where he's been staying throughout his negotiations with the Japanese government. They're upset about the sanctions and the embargoes, but Grew's been trying to find a diplomatic way to maintain peace while also moderating Japanese ambitions. Now he fears for his life, as the information he's uncovered will almost certainly lead to war. He bursts through the front doors of the building that acts as the United States intelligence base of operations. "I need to send a wire to the president," he screams at the staff, who are monitoring different communications in the area. Everyone stares at him in shock. The ambassador's shirt is untucked, his face covered in dirt. If they didn't know any better, the staff would have thought this was just some crazy man who wandered in off the street. But they quickly recognize the ambassador and escort him to the back of the room. There he writes a message that will be wired back to the United States. When it's finished, he looks at the other Americans in the room. "Pack your stuff," he says. "When the president gets this wire, we'll need to be ready to leave Japan at a moment's notice." An intelligence officer runs through the halls of the White House. The president is meeting with the senior military staff about the escalating tensions in the Pacific. The officer enters the room. Everyone turns to look at him. In his hand, he clutches a piece of paper. He just received a communication from the ambassador to Japan. The intelligence officer cautiously walks up to the president. "This just came over the wire for you, sir. You need to read it immediately." The president takes the message and scans it. The communication is from Joseph Grew, Roosevelt says out loud. He's just discovered plans that Japan will launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. There's silence in the room. The chief of naval operations speaks first. "That can't possibly be true. There's no way the Japanese would attack the Pacific Fleet without first declaring war, and there's no indication they're prepared to do so." The rest of the military leaders in the room agree. "It's far more likely the Japanese will attack Manila in the Philippines if they ever dare to start a war with us," the naval officer concludes. The president reads the message one more time. He crumples it up and gives it back to the intelligence officer. "It's agreed then," Roosevelt responds. "An attack on Pearl Harbor is not plausible. We'll operate under the assumption that if Japan does become aggressive, we need to mount a defense in the Philippines." The intelligence officer is dismissed. The meeting between his military leaders and the president continues. There's no warning sent to Pearl Harbor or any other military installation in Hawaii about the communication that Ambassador Joseph Grew sent. February 1941, 10 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. "I'm happy to announce the new admiral of the Pacific Fleet, Husband E. Kimmel." The roar of applause fills the warm Hawaiian air. There's a lot to do now that Admiral Kimmel is in command. A celebratory dinner was planned in his honor, but first he must talk to Lieutenant General Walter C. Short about the defense of the islands. Using the intel that's been sent to them, they devise a plan to protect the islands from any threat. Both Kimmel and Short are not privy to the communication sent by Ambassador Grew, so they do not know the true extent of a Japanese threat on their forces. However, both men decide, without having all the information, that the island's defenses are lacking and ask Washington for additional men and equipment. Washington says they'll consider it. For now, Kimmel and Short must do their best with what they have. May 1941, 7 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Kichisoburo Nomura of the Imperial Japanese Navy explains the situation. "They've broken our codes," he shouts. "The Americans know everything we've been planning. The rest of the Japanese leadership, except for a select few, disregard Nomura's warning. There's no way the U.S. could have broken their codes. And if they had, surely there would have been some sort of repercussion for the planning of a secret attack at one of their naval installations." Nomura pleads with the Japanese leadership to change their plans, or at the very least, to use new codes. His requests all fall on deaf ears. An SIS intelligence officer waits until the room is clear. He sneaks into the Japanese office and quickly takes pictures of the documents lying on the desk. The pictures are brought back to the analysts working for the United States Army's Signals Intelligence Service and the Navy's Communications Special Unit, both of which are part of the MAGIC program to decrypt Japanese communications. These coded documents, along with the intercepted encrypted Morse code messages sent between diplomats and the Japanese military, begin to paint a clearer picture of what they have planned in the Pacific. All intercepted communications are sent back to Washington. However, much of the intel is never forwarded to Kimmel and Short in Hawaii. July 1941, 5 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto stares through the lenses of his binoculars, watching his fleet carry out a series of maneuvers. For now, he and the highest-ranking military officers are the only ones who know about what they're training for. Every day, relations between Japan and the United States become more and more tense. Every day, Yamamoto advocates for another solution besides war. But the leadership of Japan and the Prime Minister Tojo Hideki in particular doesn't want to hear words of doubt. They will declare war on the United States with or without Yamamoto's help. Admiral Yamamoto gives in and advises that the only hope Japan has is to attack the naval base at Pearl Harbor and crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet before they can be sent further west. Now every day is a new naval exercise. Sailors are drilled and pushed to their limit. The ships sail through rough waters to ready their crews for the journey to come. Pilots regularly practice their maneuvers after launching from the decks of carriers. This will be the largest and most important modern assault in Japanese naval history. Yamamoto just prays that it is enough to cripple the U.S. fleet, otherwise all will be lost. September 24, 1941, less than 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Sir, we have to let Kimmel and Short know about this, the intelligence officer says. They just intercepted a coded transmission from Japanese naval intelligence to Japan's consul general in Honolulu, asking for a grid of the exact locations of ships in Pearl Harbor. The message is called the bomb plot, and it's a clear indication that the Japanese have an interest in the U.S. forces stationed there. The culmination of all the deciphered messages and communications clearly reveals that the Japanese are planning something. Yet Washington seems to have its own agenda. We will consider what this means for our forces in the Pacific, the general says, taking the bomb plot message from the intelligence officer. Thank you for your hard work. You can return to your post. But sir, the intelligence officer tries to protest. I said you are dismissed. The conversation is over. The bomb plot message is filed away and is never sent to Admiral Kimmel or General Short. November 16, 1941, 21 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Sirens wail throughout the Japanese I-400 class submarine as it prepares to dive. Sailors make final preparations before the sub descends into the dark depths of the Pacific. On board, they carry Type A midget submarines, which will be launched into the waters of Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. November 26, 1941, 11 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands aboard the bridge of the attack fleet's flagship. He's received the command for all vessels to begin their journey to Hawaii. The fleet consists of over 60 ships, 6 of which are aircraft carriers, and more than a dozen warships. The rest of the vessels are for support, but it's more than enough to annihilate the U.S. forces stationed at Pearl Harbor. November 27, 1941, 10 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Did you see the communication from Washington? Admiral Kimmel asks General Short. Yeah, it said there could be a possible Japanese attack on American targets in the Pacific. It didn't seem too concerned about us, though, Short replies. The Admiral nods his head. We should still keep a close eye on things, Kimmel notes. They filed the communication away and continue to conduct routine defensive measures. The request for more men and equipment still hasn't been approved. Seems as if the government sees no serious threat to the ships and men stationed at Pearl Harbor. November 28, 1941, 9 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. A horn blast cuts through the salty Hawaiian air. Military personnel wave to Task Force 8 as it leaves Pearl Harbor for Wake Island in the middle of the Pacific. There's a U.S. military base there, but the mission itself is classified. The USS Enterprise, one of the 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet, and 12 other ships leave the blue waters of Pearl Harbor and embark on their journey. December 5, 1941, 2 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Rear Admiral John H. Newton salutes from the deck of the USS Lexington as the aircraft carrier leaves Pearl Harbor to deliver 18-Vought SB-2U-3 Vindicators of the Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 231 to Midway Island. At that same time, the USS Saratoga, which was also normally stationed at Pearl Harbor, has just completed repairs and modifications at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. It's sailing to Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego before it's scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor and regroup with the rest of the Pacific Fleet. At this point in time, none of the aircraft carriers are docked at Pearl Harbor, but there is no way for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to know this as his attack force gets closer and closer to the Hawaiian Islands. December 6, 1941, late in the evening, less than 12 hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. U.S. intelligence is buzzing. A newly deciphered message indicates there's a deadline for Japanese action scheduled for the following morning. It's not clear from the message exactly what the action will be, but it can't be good. The President of the United States and his advisors don't believe Japan will launch an attack until a declaration of war has been announced. Analysts scramble to try to uncover more information. Half a world away, Ambassador Joseph Grew sits in his office. There is shouting outside his door and the sound of something hitting the ground. He stares at the entryway as several shadows materialize on the other side of the frosted glass door window. The door is forced open, and several Japanese soldiers swarm the office. They take Grew captive in preparation for what is to come. December 7, 1941, 3:42 a.m., 4 hours before the attack on Pearl Harbor. A sailor aboard the USS Condor spots something in the water. "Sir, I think you should take a look at this." The captain walks over to his station. "What is that?" the captain asks. He looks around the bridge. All eyes are on him. The captain of the Condor runs to the side of the ship. "Get me binoculars," he shouts. The captain stares through the lenses. The moon illuminates the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Something is cutting through the water. It looks like a periscope. He can't be sure it was a submarine that was spotted, so the minesweeper is ordered to continue its patrol to get a better handle on the situation. December 7, 1941, 6:10 a.m., 1 hour and 45 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The men stationed at Pearl Harbor begin to awake and start their morning routines. The horizon becomes red as the sun prepares to rise. It's peaceful and serene. Sailors play tennis before their duties begin. Others are already at the mess hall to have breakfast. A soldier steps out of the barracks and looks at the sunrise. He stretches out and says the old adage, not knowing how true it'll be this day: red sky at night, sailors delight; red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. There's no indication in the coming hours the island will be swarmed by Japanese aircraft and the waters will run crimson with blood. 275 miles north of the island of Oahu, the Japanese fleet has come to a stop. The sailors prepare for the attack. Planes are checked and rechecked. The position of every ship is precisely coordinated. The engines of the aircraft roar to life. Vice Admiral Nagumo gives the order to launch. Planes scream across the decks of the 6 aircraft carriers and take flight. They get into formation and begin heading toward Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, 6:45 a.m., 75 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Cannons fire and depth charges drop from the USS Ward. The Condor had been right. There was a Japanese sub in Pearl Harbor's waters. The crew of the Ward maneuvers the ship to get a better shot. The cannon fire can be heard from the shores. Some stop what they're doing to see what the commotion is. Others just chalk it up to a training exercise. The Ward stops firing to confirm if they've sunk the Japanese sub. December 7, 1941, 6:53 a.m., 62 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The captain of the Ward radios the headquarters of the 14th Naval District, which is responsible for defending the Hawaiian Islands. We've attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon a submarine operating in the defensive perimeter, the captain says. The district commandant makes an assumption that will have drastic consequences. He assumes the Japanese submarine is an isolated incident. The USS Ward is more than capable of dispatching a single sub. The commandant takes no further action. The commander of the Pacific Fleet is notified of the incident, but waits for confirmation that the sub has been destroyed before taking any further actions. December 7, 1941, 7:02 a.m., 53 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. A soldier manning a radar station on Oahu squints at his screen. What the hell is that? He asks himself. A large formation of aircraft has appeared off the coast of the island. He informs his superior, who looks at the radar readings. He walks over to the manifest hanging on the wall. The lieutenant flips through the pages, walks back to the radar station and looks at the readings again. Must be the B-17 bomber scheduled to arrive today, he says to the technician. Must have just gotten here early. He alerts no one of what has been picked up on the radar. December 7th, 1941, 7:40 a.m., 15 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The sound of plane engines breaks the peaceful serenity on Oahu. Soldiers on the north side of the island look up at the sky. They can't believe what they see. 183 Japanese aircraft fly overhead. They're armed with bombs, torpedoes, and heavy machine guns. December 7th, 1941, 7:49 a.m., 6 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. A group of Japanese planes detaches from the main attack force. They head inland toward Wheeler Field. Aircraft sit on the tarmac awaiting inspection. This is the largest airfield on the island. Gino Gasparelli walks toward the mess hall, looking at the fighter planes as he passes. He moves at a much more leisurely pace than he has for the last several days. The airfield has been on high alert for almost a week, but yesterday the alert had been called off. The 48 planes Gino passes are lined up in a row, wingtip to wingtip on the tarmac in front of their hangars. He strides toward the barracks to get changed and enjoy some R&R off base. Gino enters the barracks and begins a conversation with some of the men who are getting ready for the day. They laugh as they talk about their plans. The lightheartedness of the discussion is shattered when the drone of engines is heard outside the barracks. Gino looks around. There are no scheduled exercises today, he says to the other soldiers. Their eyes open wide as the sound of plane engines gets louder and louder. "Move!" Gino shouts. The men burst out the back door of the barracks. Gino looks up into the sky and sees several black planes flying just above the treetops. He makes eye contact with the gunner sitting in the back seat of one of the planes. Gino watches in horror as a bomb is released from the aircraft and begins to fall. He dashes back into the barracks and shouts at everyone who's still asleep or just waking up from the previous night of partying to get out now. There is no time to get dressed, grab belongings, or hesitate. The men run out of the barracks and head for cover. Gino glances at the airfield as the bomb dropped from the Japanese plane explodes, taking out one of the hangars. The platoon sergeant shouts at the men to take cover in the tree line. Gino sprints toward the trees as bullets pepper the ground all around him. The gunners are firing down at the retreating soldiers. Gino dives into the shrubs and bushes along the tree line. The rest of the squad is still making their way toward cover. They have no weapons to return fire with, as twigs and branches are shattered by machine gun fire above their heads. The planes continue to circle for several minutes, dropping bombs on the airfield and firing at anything that moves. The platoon leader orders Gino and the rest of the squad who made it to the tree line to sneak into the armory and grab the .20 caliber rifles. Others grab cement bags and create a makeshift bunker. Gino darts in between buildings. He dives under vehicles to stay out of sight of the Japanese gunners. Soldiers who have secured rifles fire up into the air to no avail. Gino grabs a cement bag and orders his squad mates to do the same. They carry the bags back to the platoon as quickly as possible. The Japanese aircraft continue south to join the rest of the attack force at Pearl Harbor. Gino looks across Wheeler Airfield and counts no fewer than 80 dead or wounded soldiers. December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. The attack on Pearl Harbor begins. Japanese aircraft appear in the sky over Pearl Harbor. They look like a swarm of locusts coming to destroy the island. The attack force is made up of Mitsubishi A6 M2 Zeros. They are fast and agile, allowing them to maneuver into striking positions and hit their targets hard. The military personnel at Pearl Harbor watch as Japanese aircraft blot out the sun and drop their payloads on ships there. Everyone who witnesses the onslaught of enemy planes approaching tries desperately to mount a defense. They have been given no warning. Unfortunately, there are thousands of soldiers who have no idea the attack has even begun. They're in the bellies of the ships, where there's no view of the outside world. Others are fast asleep after finishing their night shifts. The tragedy that is unfolding in real time is like nothing any of these men have ever experienced. As the first wave of the attack begins on Pearl Harbor, 5 ships are hit with bombs. One of these vessels is the USS Arizona. Joseph Leon George had watched as the Arizona erupted in flames, and 6 men became trapped in the ship's control tower. Now he's desperately trying to save their lives. December 7, 1941, 8 a.m., 5 minutes after the attack on Pearl Harbor began. The line that George threw to the men aboard the Arizona goes taut. They've secured their end. George shouts at them to climb across as he holds the other end of the rope to make sure it doesn't slip. One by one, the men in the control tower of the Arizona shimmy along the rope to the safety of the vessel. George and several other sailors help the men from the USS Arizona on board. The last man in the command tower grabs onto the rope and starts climbing. The flames have fully enveloped the command center. George prays the flames don't snap the rope before the sailor makes it across. It's a long way to the water surface below, and the impact would probably knock the sailor out. George urges him forward. The rope begins to fray. The fire licks at the fibers, causing them to snap one by one. "Hurry!" George shouts. The sailor grits his teeth and climbs as fast as he can. He's not going to make it, George thinks. He reaches out his hand, grabs onto the sailor, and pulls him aboard the vessel. A moment later, the rope snaps. Joseph George saved all 6 lives of the men trapped aboard the USS Arizona command tower. The battleship burns for another 2.5 days in the water of Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, 8:10 a.m., 15 minutes after the attack on Pearl Harbor began. Sterling Cale scans the harbor as the USS Arizona explodes into a fireball of shrapnel and thick black smoke. He'd just finished a long night of work as a pharmacist's mate, where he dispensed medicine. When he first saw the planes emerge in the skies over Battleship Row, he thought it was odd there was so much action on a Sunday. But once the bombs started falling, he realized this wasn't an exercise. Pearl Harbor was under attack. Cale runs toward the explosions in the harbor. He looks up just as a plane rips across the sky above him. He can see the red circles on the craft's fuselage and immediately understands that the Japanese have declared war on the United States. He stops his forward momentum and veers toward one of the armories to grab a rifle. While at the armory, Cale runs into some other soldiers from the base. They band together and run toward Battleship Row, where bombs detonate everywhere. They run toward the severely damaged USS Oklahoma. Smoke bellows from its hull and the sounds of screams cut through the air, even as explosions continue throughout the harbor. "Come on," Cale shouts. "We need to get to the Oklahoma. Save everyone we can." As they get closer, there's a gut-wrenching groaning sound. The battleship begins to list and then rolls to its side. Cale and the other men come to a stop as they watch the top of the Oklahoma disappear from view. "They still need our help," Cale yells. He continues running toward the water where the men are swimming for their lives. As he approaches the docks, Cale can feel the intense heat. But it's not just the ships that are ablaze. The water itself is on fire. The oil leaking from the ships has coated the water's surface and ignited. Now sailors desperately trying to escape the carnage are simultaneously being burnt to death while drowning. It's an image that will fuel nightmares for many years to come. Cale and the other men dive into the water. They swim under the flames to reach wounded sailors. It's dangerous, but it's their only hope. One by one, Cale and the others pull half-conscious men out of the burning waters. He sees the USS Arizona and other ships get hit again and again by Japanese bombs. Cale's in the water long after the Japanese aircraft return to their carriers. He manages to pull 45 sailors out of the water over the course of 4 hours. Some are already dead. Others are just exhausted and need a helping hand. When his body can no longer tread through the water from fatigue, Cale returns to the medical facilities and begins helping with triage. There will be no rest for several days as the aftermath of Pearl Harbor sets in, and he tries to help save as many lives as possible. December 7th, 1941, 8:17 a.m., 22 minutes after the attack on Pearl Harbor began. "Fire!" screams the captain of the USS Helm. Japanese Type A midget submarines have entered the harbor and are firing torpedoes at American ships. There are at least 5 of the subs in the harbor, but now there's one less. The helm's cannons hit one of the enemy vessels at the entrance to the harbor. It explodes and bubbles as the sub sinks to the bottom of the harbor. December 7, 1941, 8:54 a.m., the second wave begins. 170 Japanese aircraft circle around the east side of Oahu. The initial attack on Pearl Harbor has been raging for an hour. This second wave will bring even more death and destruction. Everest Capra is stationed at Hickman Field near the entrance to the harbor. When the initial attack started, Capra could see the Japanese planes in the distance. He noticed the circles on the wings and shouted, "They're here! They're here!" The entire base jumped into action. Capra and the other men at Hickman had just enough time to gear up before the first wave hit. Now the fight for their lives continues as the second wave of Japanese planes fly overhead. Capra dodges machine gun fire and explosions as he runs toward a wounded soldier. He slides across the ground to the man's side. "Are you all right?" he asks, but it's clear that the soldier has lost consciousness. Capra picks him up and slings the man across his shoulders. He carries the wounded man to the newly built hospital at the airfield and drops him off. He then immediately turns around and runs out the door to help rescue other fallen soldiers. Capra spots a man crawling for cover. He races toward the wounded soldier. At that moment, a bomb falls from the sky. It detonates next to Capra, sending him flying through the air. He hits the ground hard and blacks out. When he finally comes to, it's clear that at least some time has passed. There are still Japanese planes in the sky, but fewer than before. Capra rubs his head and feels warm liquid running down his cheek. He looks at his hands and sees that his index finger is hanging by a thread. Capra tries to stand up but falls back to the ground. He's bleeding badly from his leg. He crawls to a nearby barrack and finds masking tape. He tapes his finger back to his hand and wraps the adhesive around the wound in his leg. His biggest fear is that if he went to the hospital, they'd put him in a bed, and he wouldn't be able to help his comrades. With his finger secured and the bleeding under control, Capra runs back onto the airfield looking for more wounded soldiers to help. December 7, 1941, 9:30 a.m., 1 hour and 35 minutes after the initial attack on Pearl Harbor began. The USS Shaw explodes in dry dock. Every single battleship at Pearl Harbor has been hit, but only the USS Arizona and Oklahoma are completely destroyed. Vice Admiral Nagumo is informed that the first 2 waves failed to destroy many of the ships docked at Pearl Harbor. It's requested that a third strike be launched. "It's too risky," Nagumo says. "I'm in charge of this attacking force. We caused immense damage with minimal casualties. It's time to return home." His officers agree. The fleet prepares to sail back to Japan. Out of the 353 aircraft involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor, only 29 were lost. The remaining aircraft are recalled to their carriers. 30 minutes later, the last of the Japanese planes leaves the island of Oahu. The Japanese believe their surprise attack was a resounding success, and they have effectively crippled the Pacific Fleet. There's celebration as they make their way back to Japan. It's believed that the attack on Pearl Harbor will keep the United States from taking an offensive position in the Pacific. This will allow them to expand further along the coast of East Asia and in the Pacific Theater. However, they've made a huge miscalculation. The fact that all 3 U.S. aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor during the attack means that these ships are fully functional and ready to be deployed across the Pacific. United States oil supplies, submarines, and repair facilities around the Hawaiian Islands and at other positions in the Pacific were left untouched. Logistically, the U.S. Navy is in good shape. Even though 2 battleships were destroyed, the rest of the battleships in the Pacific Fleet are able to be repaired. This takes time, but it's a huge mistake by Japan not to make sure that the battleships were more severely damaged. December 8, 1941, 1 day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stands before Congress and speaks the first sentence in one of the most famous speeches in history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Until this point, the American public did not want the nation to enter the war, but that all changed after that attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese attack may have temporarily damaged the Pacific Fleet, but it also enraged the country, and now the United States is coming for revenge. December 16, 1941, 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Kimmel and General Short are relieved of their commands. The United States government needs a scapegoat for the 2,403 Americans that died at Pearl Harbor. Even though these 2 men were never given all the information and intel they needed to prepare for the attack, the government still blames them for what happened. The next year, the Roberts Commission, appointed by President Roosevelt, finds Kimmel and Short in dereliction of duty. The commission claims that these 2 men are solely responsible for the Pearl Harbor disaster. This decision is a gross misrepresentation of what actually transpired between the months before the attack and the attack itself. January 1944, 2 years and 1 month after the attack on Pearl Harbor. A man by the name of Captain Lawrence Safford discovers damning evidence against the U.S. government and shows they had prior knowledge of a possible attack on Pearl Harbor before it happened. Stafford was the Navy's former chief cryptographer. While going through old documents, he stumbles across evidence that Washington withheld secret information from Kimmel and Short. In light of this new evidence, 11 months later, a naval court of inquiry finds that Kimmel was in fact not derelict in his duties, but had acted appropriately with the information he had. Not wanting to be blamed by the public for the death and destruction of Pearl Harbor, the Chief of Naval Operations overrules the court's findings to protect the government. It's decided that if Kimmel had conducted aerial reconnaissance, he might have discovered the Japanese fleet off the coast of Hawaii. This is a thinly veiled attempt to protect the government and place the blame on a single individual. May 25, 1999, 57 years and 7 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a resolution is presented to the Senate. 52 senators vote in favor, 47 against. A non-binding resolution to exonerate both Kimmel and Short as the sole two individuals responsible for the disaster at Pearl Harbor is passed. The Senate requests that the President of the United States posthumously restore both of them to full rank. Then President Bill Clinton did not act on the resolution. George W. Bush did not act on the resolution. Barack Obama did not act on the resolution. Donald Trump did not act on the resolution. Joe Biden has yet to act on the resolution. Both Husband E. Kimmel and Walter Campbell Short are still officially the only two men responsible for letting the attack on Pearl Harbor occur on December 7, 1941. Now watch The Truth About Why America Dropped Atomic Bombs on Japan, or check out What Was It Like to Be a Kamikaze Pilot.